making a built-in dresser in the shop, and I came to the part where it's time to finish it. This is a paint grade project, so it's paint grade materials, and I decided to do a little bit of a longer video of my finishing process because usually I blow through that in the shop. I don't like finishing, I don't like painting, and filming just adds time onto it. So as far as finishing, this is my basic process. I will say it's not always a rule of thumb. Sometimes it's customer dependent how I finish something, and it can also be project dependent how I finish something, but in general this is my process. I start taking apart all the pieces so I could easily paint it. For this piece I decided to pop off the fronts because I used not only a cabinet grade ply for this entire piece, but it's pre-finished. So the insides are going to stay that way. It's going to be easier to paint the fronts, not attached. I only had brads on them, so it was easy to pop them off. And then I could edge band all of my plywood, which is iron on edge band. Then I could go through and fix any imperfections with putty. My putty of choice, I don't really have one, to be perfectly honest. I use what's ever in the shop, which is usually what's cheapest at the store. I've been buying this one that changes color just because it's fairly inexpensive. It dries really fast. For bigger pieces, or if I accidentally take a chunk off of something or have to build up detail, I will use Bondo, but for brad holes, it will end up costing a little bit more. It takes longer. It doesn't take longer to dry, but it will take longer to sand because it's a harder material. And then I just go through and overfill everything, especially this material here. It's going to have moisture in it. When this dries, that moisture evaporates. If you don't overfill, it could actually shrink into the hole and you end up having to do it twice. I'm going to continue deconstructing this because I'm actually going to roll the face frames on the cabinet. Like I said, my ply of choice on this is pre-finished cabinet grade ply, but the face frame is all poplar. That's the hardwood I use when I'm painting stuff. So that is what's on the front here, and then I just taped off the edges so I could easily roll it. Once all of my filler is dry, I'm just going to lightly sand it. There's a speed dial on my sander. I think most modern sanders will have that. I usually dial it down so it doesn't dig into the finish. I'm just going to take all of that material down till everything's flat. You're really going to use your sense of touch when you're painting versus your sense of sight, because your sense of touch is going to pick up on imperfections your eyes aren't. So same thing for the hardwood. I'm going to just sand it lightly. I know some people rely on raising the grain before finishing any pieces, which is essentially flooding the surface with water. As that water absorbs into the wood, it will raise little pieces of the grain and make it rough, and they'll sand it. Personally, I find that to just be an added step because I already know I'm going to be sanding in between my coats of primer. This ceiling is a perfect example of changing my order of operations. Because it's a ceiling, I didn't sand at all. No one's going to be climbing on a ladder to touch that, and it's a waste of time. So you could see how some projects are specific for how you finish. My primer of choice is going to be Kills. It's readily available everywhere. I've used the oil base, but pretty much I stick to the latex base now. It's hour dry. It has the regular brand has pretty high hiding, which is nice. Stuff won't bleed through. When I have something I'm painting over, like old stained wood, something that you need a scent blocker with, or you have wood that has tannins in it and is bleeding through, I wrote it on there because obviously I'd spill paint on it, but Zinsser makes a paint called Bin, which has shellac in it. This is one of the best primers I've ever used for hiding stains, stain blocking, and coverage. I don't use that on everything just because it's really expensive. For the gun, I'm using this cheap $50 gun on Amazon. I used to have one that worked with my air compressor, but it was kind of a pain. I watched a bunch of YouTube videos. People seem to like this one. Been using it for about a year. I've painted everything from cabinets to large built-ins. Someone actually just borrowed it from me to paint their whole kitchen. It turned out great. They had no problems with it. You could see I don't even do a great job of cleaning it in between jobs, and it works really well. And like I said, for the $50 price point, you really can't beat that. Now, if you're not doing this all the time, you don't want to do this as a career, you can see I'm rolling here because obviously I don't want to take all of my hardware out and put it back in, and I don't want to get paint on the pre-finished ply. So I decided to roll this portion of the build. And if you have a decent grade roller and you take your time, you can get a really nice finish with a roller. Don't feel like you have to go out and buy a paint sprayer. If you only want to do a piece or two of furniture, it's really not worth that cost. If you plan on doing it a couple times, it might be, because once you buy all of the rollers and the bins and what, a couple times you could have bought the sprayer. So I just put a very quick coat on all of my stuff. A lot of times I end up doing 2 coats of primer, because as you see, when you put that coat of primer on, especially because this is a white material, it's going to show shadows and imperfections. So I'll fix those in between coats. Now, like I said, I don't pre-raise the grain, but that means the primer is going to raise it for me. So before I go about doing any patching or my second coat, I take a 120, 150 grit sandpaper and just lightly go over the whole surface. You saw about how fast I was going. I'm going to use my hands in order to tell me what parts I missed and what parts I still need to get until it's smooth. So example of something I miss, if you don't adhere all of your edge banding properly, the moisture in that primer is going to make it bubble. So I go through and fix a couple little spots I missed. And then on the tabletop, I missed putting patch on where I joined the front edge of the tabletop to the ply. So I'll just go through once again and add little pieces. If you're going to caulk, because sometimes if I'm doing cabinets, I'll caulk the corners, or you're going to add more joint compound. At this point, some people would skip ahead to finish coat. I recommend spot priming all of that stuff that you patched again, especially caulk. Usually paint doesn't stick very well to caulk, so you have to prime it first. So like I said, if you get to a point where you've already put your finish on and you mess it up and you have to go back and fix a spot, just make sure to spot prime those spots. And then it actually turned out easier to roll the edges of all of my doors, so I was rolling those as well. And then, like I said, this is second coat. Like I said, again, I usually do 2 coats of primer. They're usually quite light coats because the sprayer is not going to put on paint as thick as a roller or even a paintbrush. So it's easy enough to just do 2 coats. And like I said, I sand and fix my imperfections in between. Now, if I was doing the top coat on this, once this primer dried, I might do a light sanding if there's still any rough spots, but pretty much after this, I would do the exact same process for the top coat, and that is basically how I would go about doing it. So it can really take some time. I worked on this over the course of a couple days, make sure everything's really dry. If you rush it, it's when stuff starts to fall apart. My shop's really dusty, so I make sure I clean it as good as possible before I go in and do everything. And then I will reassemble this, partially for the video, but also because I have to put my door fronts back on, and I do all my final adjusting at the customer's house, but I wanted to make sure everything still kind of fit pretty well. And you can see it's a pretty flawless finish with that sprayer. I am going to have to spot patch these and then paint again, like I said, because I knew I would have to reattach them with brads. But it's a pretty simple process if you're doing a smaller piece of furniture like this. Like I've said, I've done large built-ins in the shop. Sanding in between each layer can be a pain. So my reveals still need to be fixed on this, but this is essentially the finished product. So I hope this takes some of the questions out of the painting process. Once you have your own process, it becomes much easier, but the really important part is to just take your time, sand in between those coats, and get a nice smooth finish.